Okay, welcome everybody to this great presentation. I'm really excited to introduce Sam and Kristen, and they're going to be talking about inclusive and proactive mindfulness in schools that meet all students' needs. So take it away.
So I think Kristen
Looks frozen.
looks frozen. I always say whenever I give a presentation, a presentation isn't complete without some technical difficulties.
That's the story of my life too. Yeah, we all get that, no problem.
All right, Kristen, you back? Now we cannot hear you.
It's okay. Let's see, you're not muted. Let's see. Hello? No?
No.
You want to try it without your headphones maybe and just talk with the computer? Just have it on. That could work. Let's see if that works. It's okay.
All right, no worries. Why don't I get us started and then you'll pick up when you get back.
Here we go.
All right. So welcome everyone to our session. Our session's title is Inclusive and Proactive Mindfulness in Schools that Meet All Students' Needs. So really kind of emphasizing this idea of how do we use mindfulness and pair it with inclusive practices as a strategy to proactively support the social, emotional, as well as academic needs of all students. We wanted to take a moment to share about where we are coming from and the land that we are speaking from. Kristen is in San Francisco, California. I am in Natomas, just north of Sacramento, California. So we are both wide-eyed and bushy-tailed, somewhat early on a Saturday morning, but thrilled to be here with you and speaking from these native lands. Kristen, you back?
I think so. Can you hear me?
We can.
Excellent. Oh my gosh. Okay.
All right.
Great.
So I'll take over just running the slides, but I'll let you speak now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for your patience and understanding. These gremlins happen. So yeah, we always want to, center ourselves in the work, but we also want to remind ourselves that, we are participating from unceded ancestral lands. And part of my work as an educator and a researcher is to remind myself that the ancestors and elders that are the stewards of the land that we live and work on. So we always want to make sure that we're recognizing them. And then in addition to that, there are two links that are embedded into the slide deck. I'm going to upload the slide deck directly that you can find out what ancestral land you are currently inhabiting, as well as checking to see if there are any organizations where you can pay shumi. So shumi is an Ohlone word for land tax. So the Ohlone tribe are the native peoples of San Francisco. So providing some reparations to the native peoples that are the ancestral lands that you live on currently. And I would be remiss if we did not mention the passing of Judy Heumann last week. She was a disability and civil rights activist. She was instrumental in making sure that the Section 504 regulations and protections were signed into law, and was a member of the Clinton and Obama administrations, ensuring that folks with disabilities were visible and seen in laws that were passed. You might be familiar with her. She was featured in the 2020 documentary Crip Camp, and just a really important member of the disability rights community. So, we remember her. And yeah, definitely, if you're not familiar with Judy's work, I would encourage you to do some research on her.
I want to take a moment to introduce myself. My name is Sam Drazin. I always feel a little silly saying my name on Zoom because we all have like our own little name tags. But my name is Sam Drazin. Like I said previously, I am in Sacramento, California. I started my career actually as a paraeducator, then became a 5th grade teacher, 3rd grade teacher. So shout out to anyone who's working with elementary age students. I left the classroom about 10 years ago to start Changing Perspectives, for which I'm the founder and executive director. And in that role, I do a multitude of things, but one of the things that I do is present to educators, I present to students, I present to administrators, I present to families and parents, really on issues of social emotional learning and well-being, inclusive education, and really how do we transform our schools to be schools where all students feel a greater sense of belonging and can fully participate. I've intentionally put my email address up here on the screen. I invite you to reach out to me after today's presentation. I'm happy to have a follow-up call with anyone to learn more about the work that you're doing and offer any support that I can offer. A little bit more about my nonprofit, Changing Perspectives. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization. I encourage and invite you to follow and like us on social media or check out our website to learn more. What we do is we partner and collaborate with schools and districts across the country to support their work in both SEL as well as creating equitable and inclusive learning communities, really with a focus on students with disabilities. We do our work in 3 different ways. We have pre-K through high school, social emotional learning, and what we call disability awareness curriculum available. We provide educator professional development. And we also work with schools to facilitate or co-facilitate family engagement workshops. Again, more than happy to speak with anyone after today's session, more specifically about Changing Perspectives and how we might be able to collaborate and support the work that you're doing in your school community.
Yeah, and I can definitely introduce myself. So I'm Kristen Vogel-Campbell. I use she, her pronouns. I have been a special education teacher for about 20 years in a range of settings, both special day, self-contained classroom, resource specialist. I've worked in non-public schools for students whose needs cannot be met inside the school district. And for the past 7 years, I've served as a district administrator, as a program specialist, as a director of special education. And currently I am the coordinator of special education for San Mateo Foster City. We're about 15 miles south of San Francisco. And my other role is a practitioner researcher. So I'm really excited that later on this year with Roman and Littlefield, I have a book coming out, partnering with culturally and linguistically diverse families in special education. My email address is also here. I can put it in the chat. Definitely find me on LinkedIn. I don't have a website right now. That is another piece that I am in the process of getting set up, but I'm really excited to be here with you all in community this morning.
All right, so now that you know a little bit about Kristen and I, who we are, what we do, why we're here, the ancestral lands that we currently inhabit, let's jump into the meat of today's presentation. So on our agenda, we really have divided out this pretty big concept of inclusive and proactive mindfulness in schools into really 4 different areas. We're going to start by really identifying, defining, and kind of clearly articulating what is SEL, what is mindfulness, and where is that point of intersection. After that, we're going to jump into a little bit of the nuts and bolts, but again, it's important we have some common understanding around, what are the supports for students who receive a 504 accommodation and or an IEP. And then lastly, what teachers always want, tools for the toolbox. We'll end with some specific universal proactive strategies, but it's important that we lay the foundation, create some common understanding first before we get to tools. And then we do have a limited amount of time this morning, but we will save some time for Q&A. I do invite you throughout the session to drop your questions, to drop your comments in the chat. One of the things that I think is a benefit of presenting virtually on Zoom is that we have that chat feature as like an additional dimension. So please don't hesitate. Drop clarifications, your aha moments, your I never thought about this, your wonderings in the chat as we go. And we'll make sure that we acknowledge those at the end of today's session. So let's start by identifying what is social emotional learning. Social emotional learning, or the acronym SEL, is a buzzword right now. It's very trendy. But I think it's something we need to remember. It's not new, right? Like SEL has been around for a long, long time. It's just post-pandemic, schools are realizing, wow, if we don't address this, we're not going to help our students make academic gains. So I want to acknowledge that the wheel on the right is from CASEL, the Collaborative of Academic and Social Emotional Learning. They're really the national, if not international, leaders when it comes to research and policy around social emotional learning. And they have taken this huge concept and diluted it into 5 core areas. There's a lot of really, I think, somewhat complicated definitions of what SEL is. And a definition that I really like is on the left here. It just says, SEL is a set of transferable, universal skills that we use throughout our entire lives, right? Like that is it. It is skills that we teach students in a variety of settings, and then they are able to take those skills and concepts and apply them in different settings. They're skills that are not stagnant, they are fluid, they are changing, and that the skills and concepts fall within these 5 areas in the wheel that you see on the right of the screen. So what is mindfulness? So mindfulness is the state of intentionally being aware of our actions and our feelings. All right, so we have SEL, a set of transferable universal skills that we use throughout our entire lives within those 5 areas. We have mindfulness, which is kind of this inner state of being aware of how am I feeling and how are my actions perhaps going to be influenced, hopefully positively, but we all know for ourselves as human beings, sometimes negatively, by those feelings. So this is my favorite slide coming up. So what is the intersection? Right. And I think, in schools, we departmentalize everything, right? Like I remember even as a gen ed, self-contained classroom, 8 to 8:30 was this subject, 8:30 to 9, it was this subject, right? And then as you get to middle and high school, it's even departmentalized even more. So I think this slide is really, really, really important. So what is the intersection between SEL and mindfulness? Well, what we've done here is in the center of this character in the screen, we have the word mindfulness. Mindfulness really works from the inside out, right? We're identifying our thoughts and our feelings, and we're being aware of it. So that's on the inside. Inside out. Social emotional learning is being aware of what's happening around us. So that social awareness, recognizing different people, their actions. Social awareness is about responsible decision-making and how that impacts other folks. It's about relationship skills. So social emotional learning is really working from the outside in. And the point of intersection is where our own sense of mindfulness, our own ability to recognize and be aware of our thoughts and feelings connect with the outside world that we're aware of when we have a social and emotional perspective, when we have that social awareness. So as we kind of go through today's presentation, really think about this idea of the intersection of mindfulness, being aware of what our feelings are on the inside and pushing those out to our outside behavior, and being aware of what's happening around us and how what's happening around us is going to connect to our feelings on the inside.
Yeah, so I can take over. So we're talking about the intersection of mindfulness and social emotional learning. So essentially what we're doing is we're cross-pollinating these two theories or silos. And like part of my work as a researcher is how we meld and combine multiple theoretical frameworks so that they're meaningful for us and that we can make them our own. And citing my sources, because that's what I've been taught. So Wade Toller and Thurius are two researchers in disability studies and education. They've come up with the terminology of cross-pollination. And that really describes the power of utilizing those multiple resources and frames to create new possibilities. So I always use the terms possibilities, opening doors, thinking about, what can happen if we take two things that might have been siloed in the past and putting them together. So we're cross-pollinating mindfulness and social emotional learning. Yeah, so IEP versus a 504 plan. And I think as educators, these two documents are things that we, even when I was a classroom teacher, I struggled with being able to understand the difference between the two. So the IEP is guided by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And the 504 is written in alignment with the section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Section 504 provides protections to students with disabilities. IEPs, for the most part, when we think of a student with an IEP, we're thinking explicitly of students that require special education services. And a 504 plan is, for the majority of the time, students that require accommodations to access the education, where an IEP is a little bit more in depth. Both of them are protected by federal laws, as I had said. Yeah, just making sure that when we talk about silos, IEPs are generally housed within special education. 504 plans are usually housed within general education. And a 504 plan is not just something that is applicable to a student in elementary, middle, or high school. 504 plans are applicable to college and folks that are working in settings, in work and accessibility, just overall. Yeah, so when we talk about systems change and working to tweak the system to meet the needs of all students, we usually think about like making those broad strokes at the top, like changing policies, changing practices, adding more money to things. But when we think about it, when we look at this structure of the 6 conditions of systems change, what's really at the bottom and the foundation are mental models. So we all know that if there's a new initiative that we attend a professional development on, if there's not a buy-in from the staff, or if it's not something that the staff genuinely have had input in, if the mental models are not there, that change is not going to be effective. So we need to build from the ground up as opposed from the top down. So once we have mental models and ways of thinking, that's when we start building with those relationships and connections, power dynamics, thinking about who's making decisions, who's involved, whose voices are silenced, Usually our students' voices are not included in any type of those decisions. So we need to make sure that they're incorporated. And then once we have those foundational pieces in place, then policies, practices, and money flow, that's when it's really going to be effective.
So a lot of times, one of the things that I find in my work is that mindfulness and social emotional learning is done reactively, right? It's not a proactive approach. It's there's a crisis at the school, kids aren't listening, teachers are feeling overwhelmed. Okay, all of a sudden, we're going to do all this mindfulness and all this SEL, and then things get level again, and we go back to things, and then we go back, right? It becomes a Band-Aid approach, which is reactive. And one of the things that Kristen and I really wanted to emphasize is the value of this work being proactive. And one thing we need to think about when we consider proactive approaches is what is crisis, right? Because that's kind of a word that teachers and schools use. We're in crisis, we need this. So when we think about defining crisis, we can really think about it in 4 areas, right? When we think about, if anyone on this call has, worked with students who, have a hard time managing their emotions, right? Like I've had chairs thrown at me, I've been sworn at, like I've had all that stuff happen. And I think we probably all, I see other hands, right? We've all been in that situation, right? So how do we define crisis when it comes to students? Well, one, we need to be aware of what is happening to a student before they become before they struggle to manage their emotions, right? Almost like that antecedent, if we want to think about like Ross Greene's work, like what is the antecedent? What is the pre-crisis? What is the trigger? And how can we as practitioners of this work be aware of that, right? And how do we start to separate a student from a behavior, right? A student isn't a bad student. There's something going on that is triggering a pre-crisis experience, right? Number 2 is the crisis itself. And again, how do we identify the crisis as that? Not the student, but a specific behavior, right? As I've described, student is feeling a very, very big emotion or multiple emotions at a singular time, and they're having a hard time regulating their response to that. 3 is the response. That's the educator's immediate response to the crisis, right? And the response is going to be varied based on the relationship that the educator has with the student. 4 is, I think, really the opportunity to proactively support and mitigate less crises going forward, right? That's that reflection. And oftentimes that's the part that we negate in schools because we're so busy. It's like, go to the office and then that's it, right? We never really process. We don't think about, are there strategies that we could proactively teach a student? So next time they're in number 1, that pre-crisis state, they have strategies that they can use so they don't get to number 2. And again, as Kristen said, we're going to upload this slide. I think whenever I present at conferences, it's not just about empowering you with new information, but it's empowering you with new information and models of theory that maybe you can bring back to your colleagues, right? It's about taking these really complex and sometimes overwhelming ideas and reduce them into a way that's very digestible for other people to understand.
Yeah.
So
And
why? Oh,
sorry, can I add a little bit? So also when we talk about crisis and we talk about that proactive versus reactive strategy, thinking about putting on my special education hat, we always talk about behavior intervention plans. And behavior intervention plans can be an amazing resource for proactively addressing student behavior. A lot of times those things are only developed after the chair has been thrown, after there's already been harm done in the classroom to both the student, the community, and the teacher. And that's when we have that mindset and mental model issue. So, one of the things that we do proactively is at the beginning of the year, doing making sure that we can address those behavior pieces before they escalate. Sorry, Sam, I just wanted to make sure that I added that.
No, that's great. And it's actually a perfect segue, Kristen, to this slide, which is, so why proactive approaches? And again, I recognize that I may be speaking to the choir here because you're all choosing to spend your Saturday morning engaging in this important and meaningful work. But again, hopefully there's some language here you could bring back to inspire and motivate colleagues in your school. So why take the time to do the proactive, right? Again, as Kristen described, a lot of times schools don't really do anything till number 2 happens, right? So how do we start this even before number 1, and why? Well, 1, when we do proactive approaches, it provides opportunities for that reflection, which is really the most important. Like we can't change our behavior going forward if we don't reflect on our current behavior and our past lived experiences. One of the really big barriers, especially for students who might have an IEP or 504, is language-based barriers, right? Whether that's a language-based learning disability, auditory processing, executive functioning challenges, right? A lot of times, and even SEL, like if you go back to that wheel I shared, SEL is an incredibly language dense subject matter, right? Empathy, diversity, equity, social awareness, like there's just a lot of language in there. So when we're proactive, it allows us to provide common language between teachers and students. So next time a teacher says to a student, remember to do, X, Y, or Z strategy, like they understand what that language is. I noticed that in a lot of schools, teachers try to teach regulation strategies when a student is in crisis, right? We know that when the blood runs to that prefrontal cortex, a student is not receptive to new strategies, right? So proactive is about teaching strategies while students are emotionally regulated, right? So that they can absorb that information, they can build the common language. So then when they're feeling dysregulated, they have the strategies to use. And again, it's about proactive approaches to support reactive facilitation. So I just want to, before Kristen jumps in, I just want to kind of recap what we've talked about, because I know we're covering a lot in a very short period of time. So we started by defining terms. What is social emotional learning? What is what is mindfulness? I shared that slide where we talked about mindfulness is on the inside, working its way on the outside. Social emotional learning are inputs and experiences coming from the outside, working the way on the inside, and that intersection between the two meet. Kristen talked about the terms of cross-pollination, the difference between an IEP and a 504. We just talked about the cycle of a crisis, from pre-crisis to reflection, and the value of proactive strategies. Now that we've done all that, we'd like to fill your toolbox a little bit more.
Yeah, and the next couple of slides, based on my experience in the classroom and as a coach and an administrator, as well as Sam's experience in the classroom and as a coach and a person who has supported schools. These are some really effective strategies that have worked for us that I continue to recommend and implement in the classrooms that I support. And the slide deck will be available in the Google Drive, so that anything that's hyperlinked, you'll be available to click on. So the power of kind of those like community meetings, either in the morning or in the afternoon. I know that some sites that I work with like to have a Monday morning meeting to kind of regulate and bring students back into the learning setting, to kind of get an assessment of like what kind of space those kids are coming in after a weekend. And then on Friday to kind of close out the week and to set them off into the weekend where they, might encounter, some difficult situations, so that they have those tools. And then I have hyperlinked relationship building cue cards. Those are just some handy things that even though we all know how to, work with students, sometimes if we get, stuck on an idea, it's just a bunch of cards that give us a prompt that we can share with students that gives them the opportunity to be vulnerable, but not, but in a way that is comfortable for them sharing in a community meeting.
Can I, oh,
Yeah,
can I
no,
go to like the third bullet, Kristen? And I want to be mindful of time too, so we have time for questions. I just want to, really call out this one, using visuals where students see themselves and are represented. I think that's hugely important. And a lot of times when I walk into a classroom, I see, the scholastic posters and all of that. And it's like, we don't need to buy posters that show students doing mindfulness exercises. We can have the students create their own, displays. And you could take pictures of students doing 5-finger breathing and post that on your wall. It's really important that students are able to see themselves and see that they are represented in the visual reminders around the classroom on the strategies that they can use in those pre-crisis moments.
Yeah, and kind of adding to what Sam just said, having the students visually represented on the walls or in, photos, that really that centers the students in their own practice, and making sure that students are always part of decision-making processes in classroom community agreements, making sure that they understand the power of their own voice, either verbal or if they're using a communication device, the power of agency and the self-advocacy. And I know that Sam, one of the things that, when we work together, self-advocacy is always a really strong piece that he works on supporting educators and families with.
And I'm going to share a little bit more about that. So the way that I like to help educators consider how do we help all students, but specifically students who might be identified as having a disability, how do we help them become advocates for themselves? So advocacy is an action. In order to be an advocate for yourself, you need to have confidence in who you are. And in order to have confidence in who you are, you need to know who you are. So I like to think about it as this 3-part model, from self-awareness to self-confidence to self-advocacy. So one of the other pieces of kind of universal proactive approaches is that we have to ensure that the strategies we support students on with are transferable, right? Like these can't be strategies that you can only use in Mr. Drazin's math class, right? We have to help students, and sometimes we have to help students see the transferability, right? So in a lot of times when we're doing mindfulness or SEL, there's like role-playing scenarios, and I always encourage educators, ensure that those role-playing scenarios are relevant to the past and current lived experience of students, right? If you're working with a group of students who have never been on an airplane, having a role play about being in an airport and going on an airplane is just not relevant to them, right? So ensure that what you're sharing is relevant, and know that we may need to be a little more explicit in how they can transfer this to the multiple places and spaces that they may find themselves. Anything else you want to add, Kristen, before we open it up to Q&A?
No, I'd like to make sure that we have time, and I saw that our 5-minute warning is here, so I'm opening up that 5 minutes to Q&A.
So I'm going to stop the screen share, and more than happy to hear your thoughts, your questions, your aha moments, your more wonderings.
I have a comment / I guess question. I work in a private school, so it's different than a large percentage of the members of COSM at this point, although one of my goals is to bring this into the private sector. We don't really do IEPs per se, but we have a learning specialist. We've expanded our wellness team. And we have, what we call life forms. And so when there's an issue with the kid, we as teachers can look and see, excuse me, what, there some sort of intervention or plan, but we don't call it an IEP. So my understanding from what you've said, and this is not my area of expertise, is that the 504 is automatically something that everyone everywhere can look at and say, these needs are not being met, and what can we do about it? So that's more like the law, right? What we do for people as well in private schools.
Yeah, and Sharon, I can actually, you work in a private school. What I would say is students that are in private schools still have a right to receive a evaluation. Mm-hmm. So if there's a student that you have a concern about, I would direct the parents to contact the public school district, and the public school district still has an obligation to assess that student. The assessments that the public school district provides, there's usually a lot of really great tools and accommodations and ideas of services and goals that you can take to the private school. So I would say that that's definitely what I would recommend if you have a student who is suspected of having a learning difference.
Yeah, I think they do that, but I think because it's a private school, I know that students do have evaluations done, but I think they have to do them privately and they're expensive. And I think if they can't do that, then they might be accommodated by other means. I'm not, that's not my realm. I just pass it on to learning specialists and they take care of it.
Yeah.
So
put your email in the chat and I can connect with you about that, because your students shouldn't have to pay for a private eval.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they know how they're doing it, but I just don't know.
Yeah, I want to empower you so that
thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I got the notification that
in a minute. I'm sorry. They're gonna.
Yeah, no, that's okay.
Any other questions or comments before we get booted off?
Thank you so much in advance if we do get booted off. I'm going to stop the recording just so I can get that done. Sheila, did you want to announce a winner before we get shut out here?
I sure can. So our giveaway winner for this session is Eileen Edwards, and she has won a copy of Mindwell's book, Mindful Teacher, Mindful School, Improving Wellbeing in Education, and the Mindful Teacher's Toolkit.
Welcome back, everybody.